Hello, my name is Elizabeth, this is Anna, and this is Zachary. Today we're going to be speaking about the Colombian Negotiation Agreement. Bear with us as we go through this and have a great evening.
Good evening. Today, Lizzie, Zach, and I are going to present the Colombian peace negotiation. For this, we are going to provide some background. We're going to explain the BATNA, the ZOPA, the anchors, the positions, the interests, and we're going to explain the final agreement and outcome. And at the end, we are going to provide some time for questions. To begin with, we want to provide you with some background about the conflict and the negotiation. And this is very important because it ended more than 50 years of war. Colombia is a country located in South America, as you can see on this picture. And it is not so far from here, just 5 hours away by airplane from DC. Some basic information about the negotiation is that it lasted from September 2012 until August 2016. The place decided for the negotiation was Havana, Cuba, and the name in English is Final Agreement to End the Armed Conflict and Build a Stable and Lasting Peace. Currently, the status of this agreement is signed and agreed, and this happened on November 24th, 2016. This was a multi-party negotiation with main parties and third parties. For the main parties, on the one hand, we had the national government of Colombia, and on the other hand, the FARC-EP, that stands for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army. As third parties, we have the Republic of Cuba, the Kingdom of Norway, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and the Republic of Chile. To talk about the origin of the conflict, we also have to talk about the origin of these groups. The FARC-EP was a guerrilla group formed during the Cold War period with Marxist-Leninist ideas. They were known to employ a variety of military tactics in addition to more unconventional methods, including terrorism and kidnapping. The conflict per se began in 1964 and continued for over 50 years. We Colombians faced an internal armed conflict which was characterized by intense violence and involved numerous guerrilla and paramilitary groups and also the Colombian military. Unfortunately, the production and trafficking of illicit drugs added to the complexity of the conflict and also accelerated the expansion of these armed groups. We also want to talk about the delegations and the process design. The delegations on both sides of the negotiation were composed of up to 30 people, out of which 10 could actively participate in the sessions. Both delegations brought expert advisors on specific subjects. In addition to state officials, the government's delegation included representatives from the private sector, the military, and the police forces, not present in previous peace negotiations, all of whom reported directly to President Juan Manuel Santos, who is the former president of Colombia. The FARC-EP delegation included old and new leaders representing the majority of the sections within the group. Although some important FARC leaders were not present at the beginning of the talks, they joined later as the negotiations progressed. The Havana process was designed with a specific goal in mind: to end the armed conflict and build a stable and lasting peace. For the government, this meant the establishment of territorial peace, focus on local presence of the state in places where it was absent, promoting active citizen participation and fostering social integration and reconciliation. As in any negotiation, there were many elements of process design that shaped the parties' latitude for reaching the agreement, including rules of confidentiality, protocols of public engagement, the choice of holding talks outside the country, among others. What were the Colombian peace talks? In 2012, a secret exploratory phase of talks resulted in a general agreement between the government of Colombia and the FARC-EP. The agreement set out the structure, rules, and agenda for the formal negotiation that became known as the Havana Talks. In parallel, the Colombian Congress adopted the legal framework for peace. This was an amendment of the Constitution aimed at facilitating legal flexibility for an eventual peace deal. The peace talks were divided into two initial phases. First, beginning in February 2012 and lasting for 6 months. This was the exploratory phase, which produced a 6-point negotiating agenda and detailed procedural framework. The second was the public phase, announced in September 2012 by President Santos, and formally launched in the following month based on 6 agreed agenda items. First, comprehensive rural reform. Second, political participation. Third, the problem of illicit drugs. Fourth, victims. Fifth, the end of the conflict. And finally, the implementation.
The position of the Colombian government during the conflict was that they must protect their sovereignty and the Colombian people from the violence of the FARC-EP and the oppression of a would-be Marxist-Leninist state. The government's position by the time the successful negotiations came around was to negotiate as if there is no terrorism in order to bring an end to the 50-year-old conflict, but also maintain its sovereignty over the country. President Santos at the time would often reference Yitzhak Rabin, a former Israeli prime minister who negotiated the Oslo Accords, who famously said that we'll fight terror like there's no peace and make peace like there's no terror. The Revolutionary Armed Force of Colombia held the position that the state of affairs in Colombia at the time of the conflict were too inequitable and sought to bring equality by establishing a state based on a Marxist-Leninist ideology. When violence failed, they sought to get policy concessions from the Colombian government and establish themselves as a legitimate political party. They advocated for things such as rural reform, which ensured that people all throughout Colombia had adequate access to public goods and services. This would also include things like democratizing the access of land, for example. They also advocated for women's rights and more sympathy and understanding for vulnerable and discriminated against populations. Next, we're going to go over both parties' best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or BOTNAs. Both parties have been at war for 50 years at this point. So, Colombia's best alternative would have been to continue to face and respond to the FARC-EP with continued violence and increased security measures. There is a cost to these responses, though, as Colombia's previous harsh responses are often viewed as human rights violations. Continued human rights violations may galvanize international support, and furthermore, Colombia runs the risk of radicalizing their population to support the FARC-EP. The BOTNA for the FARC-EP looks very similar to that of Colombia's. Their best alternative was also to draw out the 50-year-old war. The FARC-EP stands to gain if Colombia reacts too harshly, for before noted reasons. At the very least, they stand by their beliefs and die fighting for something they care for. You spent 50 years fighting. You know how to and have the resources to do so. They could also hold out and wait for better negotiating conditions by extending the conflict. Next, we're going to go over the Zone of Possible Agreements, also known as the ZOPA. Both parties have both a red and green line. The red line is the bare minimum that they'll agree to, the absolute worst conditions for a negotiation that they will still say yes to. The green line is the best case scenario that one can imagine. For Colombia, their red line would have been the generous public service and welfare programs that would have established greater justice as defined by a Marxist-Leninist perspective. Their green line would have been the total surrender and disarmament of the FARC-EP. The FARC-EP's red line would have been minimal movements toward more equitable conditions in Colombia by the government. Their green line would have been Colombia's current government to dissolve and hand over control of the country to the Marxist-Leninist. On this slide, we're going to visualize everything we just went through. Here we see a spectrum of different outcomes for both parties, Colombia and the FARC-EP. On the very left-hand side of the spectrum is the BATNA. The BATNA, for both parties in this case, would be to continue with the conflict. Colombia can beat out the FARC-EP eventually, but it will take a heavy toll on the population. The FARC-EP does stand to gain as well, as they can hold out for better negotiating conditions, or potentially turn the tides, as Colombia runs the risk of galvanizing international support and radicalizing the local population. Slightly to the right of the BATNA are red lines for both parties. The red line marks the beginning of the zone of possible agreements. Then, way off to the right are green lines. These green lines mark the end of the zone of possible agreements. And in between the two lines are a series of negotiated agreements that are mutually agreeable to both parties. The last thing I want to review with you is the initial proposal that both parties agreed to in August of 2012, which kicked off the negotiating process. This agreement was known as a General Agreement for the Termination of the Conflict and the Construction of a Stable and Lasting Peace. Again, this was adopted in August of 2012 and included 6 focal points with 5 key areas of policy negotiations. Those 5 areas were integral rural development, political participation, end of conflict, illicit drugs and victims, and the ratification, implementation, and verification of the final agreement, which would come in 2016. If you recall the positions page for the FARC-EP, we can see right up front that there are some serious wins for them. The integral rural development and the political participation are 2 obvious wins and concessions that Colombia made in order to end the conflict with the FARC-EP. President Santos took a big risk in doing this, and it seems to have paid off, as they did come to reach an agreement, although it may have.
In every negotiation, each party has their own personal interests while approaching the negotiation table. The Colombian government had interests in sovereignty, peace, justice, and safety. The FARC-EP had interests in protection from reprisal, reintegration, rural reform, and equality. We've come to the point where we are now getting to the agreement. This often includes public issues, and in the book, Getting More, it discusses uncovering and trading needs, attitudes, and perceptions. These all played a role in getting to the final agreement with the Colombian government in the FARC-EP. As you know, the referendum went up for a vote, and the Colombian people actually chose to reject it. It was by a very small margin. However, this margin could have been created based on attitudes, perception, and trading needs. Therefore, they went back to the table with a new strategy. Lastly, we have reached the final agreement amongst the Colombian government and the FARC-EP. This consisted of an end to conflict, implemented social programs, they made steps towards equality, ensured protection, safety to Colombians. The FARC-EP agreed to cease fire, protection from reprisal, reintegration, and rural reform. And although those 2 have agreed, the Colombian people also benefited. They were provided protection for their women and children by securing them with access to the entire rural and urban population to ensure that the Colombians have sufficient access to and availability to proper nutrition. As well, the national government is to create a land fund for the free distribution of land. These are all items that were agreed in the final agreement.